detail.
Right.
That was never what this was.
Right.
What's interesting about this is the metatextual point of that it gives you insight into what the campaign thinks is problematic about Vance. And what's interesting about it is overwhelmingly the theme that they focus on as being his liability is what makes him Trumpy. It's like the MAGA dimension to his character that they seem uneasy with, which is funny and interesting because it shows that the party is in conflict with Trump. They both need him to win, and they're uneasy with his policies, particularly the ones that tend towards isolationism and protectionism.
Yeah, there were definitely some things in here that made me personally like, oh, if this was the J.D. Vance that was put forward, I would be more receptive to him. Right. Like, for example, he was critical of Donald Trump when he assassinated Iranian General Qasem Soleimani. He described himself as a non-interventionist. These were all things they flagged as like potential political problems for him. And the two things that I found interesting was, number one, as you're laying out, the two big areas that they thought were a vulnerability for Vance were, number one, his overwhelming past criticism of Donald Trump. And I do think that turned out to be somewhat of a focus of conversation, somewhat of a liability for him. And there's chapter and verse of him going through, all the ways that he used to hate Donald Trump and think that he was unfit and believe his sexual assault accusers and all of those sorts of things, right? Which many people will be familiar with what J.D. Vance has said about Donald Trump in the past because of mainstream coverage. The other bucket was him being a non-traditional conservative and having views that, for example, talking about how he thought Democrats had some policies that would be favorable to the working class, how he had said some favorable things about unions, for example. And they saw that as a liability, which is interesting in and of itself. But the other piece that I found interesting, Ken, is what wasn't in this dossier, which is that I wondered if they had surfaced some of the comments that have genuinely been a problem for J.D. Vance, which is like his whole motif on childless cat ladies and similarly, situated commentary about women and what he thinks role for women should be, and this very sort of narrow and contemptuous view that he has of women who don't fit the prescribed roles that he would like to see them in. And none of that was in here at all. So, I mean, that's interesting in one regard because there have been a question about whether Donald Trump really realized all of these things about him, whether he would have put him on the ticket if he knew he had said all of these things. And also interesting because you realize how these standard issue Republican consulting firms, which would have been behind this type of dossier, how blind they were to what the actual liabilities would be for him in this campaign.
Exactly. And I should note, a campaign in which policy is not centered. I mean, this is a vibes campaign. I, as a reporter, am trying to find anything to be able to talk to readers about what these people stand for and what we can expect will happen. And it's really hard because they don't talk about it. I'll give you an example. I went through not just the Republican convention, but the Democratic convention. Collectively, they mentioned the word healthcare twice during the entire speeches. And in both references, they had essentially nothing to say about it. And then you look at national security, basically like slightly more to say about that, but still basically nothing. I mean, It's really hard to define what they're doing. And so when you have a document like this that gives you some sense of not just what the attitudes of the party are, but I think too why they're so quiet about a number of things, because they're uneasy with their position on a lot of different things, including on things which it's sort of counterintuitive that they are. So if this document, as was suggested by the media, it's just going to be based on polling or whatever, then they're going to talk about overwhelmingly the cat lady stuff that you're saying, because gender is a huge issue it's a huge problem Republicans face. It relates to the abortion question and is central to, I think, their main liability going into this election post Dobbs' decision in the overturn of Roe. But instead, they're interested in these positions that could be characterized to be definitely popular among the isolationist wing of the Republican base, probably so among reporters generally. And they acted as though it's a liability. That tells you that they're not primarily concerned with public opinion. They have other concerns. I mean, I'm guessing where their money comes from.
That's a very interesting point. Yeah, I mean, they had lots in there about, they knew the fact that he had these fringe extreme abortion views would be a potential problem, although it's kind of down the list in terms of the areas that they were concerned about, which is also interesting to me. But, there's also a quality to these, official campaign, like vetting documents where it doesn't take into account any of the quote unquote X factor, like whatever it is about JD Vance that just judging by the polls and the fact that he has the lowest favorability rating of, the set of the four, Kamala, Tim Walz, Donald Trump, and him, he has the lowest favorability ratings. There's no real putting your finger on whatever that lack of an X factor or whatever the off-putting nature of him, which I think is tied up in some of this like weird childless cat lady type comments. That is completely absent from this as well, which to me was an interesting insight too.
Yes.
Ken, before we move on to, sort of what has happened with you and Twitter, et cetera, since this was published, the handling of these hacked documents, obviously very different from how the media handled the Hillary Clinton campaign hacked documents back in 2016. Now, one argument you could say is, a lot of liberals were very upset about that. People like you and me supported the, publishing of those hack materials because guess what? Journalists get weird source materials from sketchy people all the time. You factor in their motivation, but if it's legitimate information, the public deserves to see it. So we supported that, but a lot of liberals didn't. And so one of the arguments is, okay, well, the news outlets were pressured by liberals to change their ways, and they basically, quote unquote, learned their lesson and decided this time around they were not going to publish hacked materials that may have come from an Iranian government actor. And again, we'll put a pin in that and discuss that more later. What is your sense of why the handling this time appears to have been so different from the handling back in 2016?
I think the point that you made is essentially right, and that's kind of half of the story. I'll get to the second half in a moment. But the first half of the story is the media has locked themselves into this narrative. I don't mean to say they've said this explicitly, but the kind of vibe in 2016 or 2017 was, on the part of a huge number of liberals was, Trump, Trump won because of election interference from the Russians. Now, if you actually break down the data and look at that, I don't think there's a lot of evidence. Yeah, not the case. but that was the vibe, and because of and when the media affirms that, then they lock themselves into that rationale. And so then when you have another foreign interference case like this, well, we've already gone pot committed for this narrative before, so I guess we have to follow through with it in the next case, and that happens to be about a Republican. It's very strange, very surreal to see these publications, Democracy Dies in Darkness. I mean, some of the most stridently, liberal and resistance figures being like, nope, we can't use this thing about JD Vance. It's like surreal. This is completely aside from why I published it, because I just generally think if something's about a public official and it relates to policy, like that's fair game. But it's just bizarre to watch. As to the second dimension that I mentioned before, I think that is much more insidious and one that's not being talked about very much. There has been, and I've reported on this on my Substack the last 5 months or so that we've run it, on the obsession with foreign influence campaigns, including disinformation. They have stood up new offices across the federal government to focus on this purported problem. Now, I don't deny that it exists. I don't deny that the Iranians, the Russians, and the Chinese are doing this. I take the intelligence community's assessments at their word, at least in broad strokes.
Yeah.
But the efficacy of those programs, there's almost no evidence to suggest that they're broadly efficacious.
It's also very selective. It's only the official bad guys that we, get upset about when they're interfering in our elections. There's been quite a bit of reporting, including by Haaretz and the New York Times, about Israeli official government influence operations, and those don't get the same level of national security state scrutiny, to say the least. Exactly.
So setting all that aside for a moment, the media sees that, and frankly, it's scary to them. I mean, when I worked at The Intercept, I got a number of the tertiary documents early, and I wanted to just publish the underlying documents, and they balked because I don't remember how it was described exactly, but there was clearly concern about just the whole. There's just this ambiance around national security and the FBI, and oh God, what do we do? And so I really think that part of this, which is not talked about, is that when the government obsesses with foreign influence campaigns, and you saw it in the case of this ridiculous. Those tenant media guys, and I mean, it's just so ridiculous.
Yeah.
And obviously, I'm fine with DOJ prosecuting that. Nope. I mean, that makes sense. But you look at the actual numbers of the videos, and you guys get more views than them in like a week. Than they did in an entire year. I mean, these are not huge operations. And again, I would like for them not to happen, but to just throw the baby out with the bathwater and say, we've got to stop doing news and give